My name is Daniel, and I work as an assistant at the morgue of St. Mary's Hospital. My job consists of assisting forensic doctors with autopsies and preparing bodies for transfer to funeral homes. It's a solitary and grim job, but it provides me with a strange sense of tranquility, a routine that allows me to disconnect from everyday problems. However, a series of disturbing events changed my perspective and made me question everything. I thought I knew about life and death. It all began on an autumn night. The air was crisp and the morgue was quiet as usual. It was around 3 a.m., the hour when most people are in deep sleep and the world seems to be suspended in a silent limbo. I was filing some documents in the office adjacent to the autopsy room when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a soft cry at first, but unmistakably the cry of a baby. I froze, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. There were no babies in the morgue, only cold, silent bodies. I stepped out of the office and walked toward the source of the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The crying grew louder as I approached the autopsy room. I slowly opened the door, expecting to see something that could explain the noise, but the room was empty, illuminated only by the cold fluorescent light. I stood there, listening, trying to pinpoint the origin of the crying. I decided to check the compartments where the bodies were stored. One by one I opened them, hoping to find something, anything, that would justify what I was hearing. But they were all either empty or contained adult bodies. There was no trace of a baby. The crying persisted, filling the air with a palpable sadness. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Perhaps it was a recording of some kind, a cruel joke played by a worker from the previous shift, but the sound was too real, too vivid. I quickly dismissed that idea. I decided to check the security cameras, hoping they might provide some answers. Back in the office, I sat in front of the monitors and rewound the footage to the moment I first heard the crying. The screens showed the autopsy room completely empty, no movement, no activity, yet the crying was clearly audible in the recording. A shiver ran down my spine. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing or hearing. The following nights were the same. Every time I was alone in the morgue, the crying returned. Sometimes it was so faint I could barely hear it. Other times it was loud and heartbreaking. I began losing sleep, my mind consumed by the constant, inexplicable sound. I felt like I was going insane, like the morgue was playing tricks on my sanity. I decided to confide in one of the forensic doctors, Dr. Mitchell. He was someone I trusted and had been working in the morgue much longer than I had. I told him about the crying, how I heard it every night and couldn't find an explanation. He looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism, but eventually agreed to stay with me one night to hear it for himself. That night, we waited in the office. Hours passed in absolute silence. I started to think maybe I had imagined everything, that stress and lack of sleep had taken their toll. But then, around 3 a.m., the crying began again. Dr. Mitchell turned pale, his eyes wide with astonishment and fear. "You hear it?" I whispered. He nodded. We rushed to the autopsy room, following the sound. The crying was louder than ever, almost deafening. We checked the compartments again, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Dr. Mitchell suggested the noise might be coming from the walls or ceiling, perhaps something in the ventilation system. But after a thorough inspection, we found nothing that could explain the source of the sound. Determined to find an answer, we decided to investigate the morgue's records, searching for any cases that might be connected to a baby. We combed through years of files, looking for anything unusual. Finally, we found a case that caught our attention. 5 years ago, a young woman named Sarah had been brought to the morgue. She had died during childbirth, and her baby was stillborn. The case had been particularly tragic and had deeply affected everyone involved. The autopsy confirmed that both mother and baby had died due to complications during labor. There was no sign of malpractice or negligence. As I read through the details of the case, a knot formed in my stomach. The date of the incident coincided with the beginning of the crying I had been hearing. We decided to dig deeper into Sarah's story by speaking with hospital staff and reviewing her medical records. We discovered that she had been alone during labor, with no family or friends by her side. The only person who had been with her in her final moments was a nurse who had left the hospital shortly after the incident. Dr. Mitchell suggested that we might be dealing with something paranormal, something beyond scientific understanding. Though I was naturally skeptical, I couldn't deny what we had experienced. We decided to take an unusual step. We called a medium. My name is Robert, and I've been working as a security guard at the municipal morgue for 10 years. It's a routine job, uneventful, where nights pass by with monotonous patrols and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. However, there were a series of nights that changed my life forever, nights that pushed me to the edge of sanity and made me realize that sometimes death is not the end. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. Every day I arrived with the same routine: greeting my co-workers from the previous shift, signing the log and heading to the surveillance room. It was a small space filled with security monitors displaying every corner of the morgue. A somber place, lit only by the glow of the screens and the faint light of a desk lamp. Everything began on a winter night. The morgue was particularly cold and desolate. The wind howled outside, and I could hear it whistling through the poorly sealed windows. At 1 a.m. I was checking the cameras as usual when I noticed something strange on the screen displaying the autopsy room. The camera was slightly out of focus, something I had never seen before. I decided to adjust the focus using the remote control, but just as I did, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. A body on one of the autopsy tables seemed to move. At first, I thought it was an optical illusion or some interference with the cameras. I leaned in closer to the monitor, observing carefully. The body moved again, this time clearly lifting a hand before letting it fall back onto the table. Panic gripped me. I knew there was no one else in the morgue. The pathologists and assistants had left hours ago. I tried to rationalize, thinking that maybe someone had stayed behind in the building as a cruel joke. I decided to review the security footage to make sure no one had entered after closing. Rewinding the footage, I watched in horror as on previous nights, the same body rose from the table around 1 a.m., took a few steps, and then lay back down. Night after night, the same sequence. A primitive fear overtook me. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical explanation. I didn't speak to anyone about it the next day, afraid they would think I was crazy or worse, accuse me of not doing my job properly. However, in the nights that followed, the pattern continued. The body would rise, walk for a few minutes, and return to the table. I had to face this directly. The next night I arrived prepared. I carried a powerful flashlight and an audio recorder, determined to capture anything that could explain what was happening. At exactly 1 a.m., the camera once again showed movement. This time I left the surveillance room and headed toward the autopsy room, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the cold was even more intense. The morgue was completely silent, except for the echo of my own footsteps. I approached the table where the body lay, the same one I had seen moving in the recordings. The air felt charged with a strange energy, something I couldn't describe. I stood there, waiting, watching. Minutes passed, and the body remained still. I began to doubt my own sanity. Maybe it was all in my head, fatigue from so many sleepless nights. I decided to return to the surveillance room. But as I walked away, I heard a sound behind me, a faint creaking like bones shifting. I spun around abruptly. The body was standing. It was staring directly at me with hollow, empty eyes. A strangled scream escaped my throat as I stumbled, backward, tripping over my own feet and falling to the floor. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps echoing on the cold marble floor. I couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed me completely. Suddenly, the figure stopped. I watched in horror as its empty eyes seemed to fill with a deep sorrow. Then it spoke, a whisper, weak but clear as water. "Help me." I don't know where I found the strength, but I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the autopsy room, slamming the door shut behind me. I rushed back to the surveillance room, gasping for air. On the monitors, the body was once again lying, motionless on the table as if nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words of the apparition echoed in my mind. "Help me rest." How could I do that? I had no idea who he was or what he truly wanted. The next day, I spent hours reviewing the morgue's records. The body belonged to a man named James Carter, who had died under suspicious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but there were rumors that he had been murdered. The police had closed the case due to a lack of evidence. That night I returned to the morgue with a new determination. If James's spirit was seeking rest, there had to be something I could do to help him. At exactly 1 a.m., I went back to the autopsy room. This time, I brought a crucifix and a small candle. Objects I hoped could provide some form of comfort. I lit the candle and placed it near the body. Stepping closer, my voice trembled as I spoke. "James, if you're here, tell me how I can help you." The air grew heavy and the candle flickered. A suffocating sense of sorrow and despair surrounded me. Suddenly, a vision flooded my mind. I saw James being attacked by a man in a dark alley, his body collapsing to the ground as his assailant fled. Then, the scene shifted to his lifeless face in the morgue, his eyes frozen in terror and pain. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there, trembling, realizing with certainty that James had been murdered. His soul couldn't rest until justice was served. I had to do something. The next day, filled with more fear than courage, I went to the police station and requested to speak with the detective who had handled James's case. Detective Ramirez listened to my account with skepticism. I avoided mentioning the supernatural aspects, sticking only to the facts, the inconsistencies in the case, the rumors of murder. To my relief, he agreed to re-examine the evidence. Weeks passed without news. I continued my nights at the morgue, torn between fear and hope. Each night I felt James' presence, but he no longer rose from the table. It was as if he was waiting, trusting me to keep my promise. Then, one night, Detective Ramirez came to the morgue. He had found new evidence pointing to a suspect, an old business partner of James, with whom he had a serious dispute. The man was arrested, and after a lengthy interrogation, he confessed to the crime. That same night, something incredible happened. As I watched the surveillance monitors, I saw James's body rise one last time. But this time, he didn't walk. He simply stood there, looking straight ahead, a faint expression of gratitude on his face. Then, his figure slowly began to fade, until there was nothing left. A single tear rolled down my cheek. I knew James had finally found peace. From that night on, the morgue returned to its usual monotony. But I was no longer the same. I had witnessed something beyond human understanding, something that taught me that justice can come from the most unexpected places, and that the dead may still have something to say. I never spoke of this to anyone. But every night, as I patrol the dark hallways of the morgue, I feel that I am not alone. And every time the wind whispers through the windows, I wonder how many other souls are still searching for their eternal rest. My name is Mark, and I am a forensic pathologist in a small town. My job is routine, almost mechanical. Every day I examine bodies, searching for answers in lifeless tissues, trying to understand the final stories of those who have passed through. My table. This is not a job for just anyone. It requires a strong stomach, emotional detachment, and a certain level of cold professionalism. Nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened to me until that series of nights that changed everything I believed about death and the beyond. The first time I heard the whispers was on an autumn night. The air was thick with humidity, and leaves swirled outside the morgue windows. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. I stayed late reviewing the report of a complicated case, a young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. The police suspected suicide, but there were signs that suggested something far more sinister. As I cut and examined, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights filled the space, accompanied only by the occasional sound of my tools. Then I heard the first whisper. It was so faint at first that I thought it was the wind or my imagination, a soft murmur, unintelligible but distinctly human. I stopped, listened, nothing. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just exhaustion. But in the following nights, the whispers became more frequent and clearer. They started as barely audible murmurs, but soon became words, phrases, fragments of conversations. I was terrified and fascinated at the same time. Could it be that the dead had something to say? Was it possible that the voices were coming from the very bodies I examined? One night, while working on an especially brutal homicide case, the whispers became impossible to ignore. The corpse belonged to a man named Louis, a local store owner who had been found stabbed in an alley. As I performed the autopsy, I heard a voice. "Help me, please." The voice was weak, full of anguish, and seemed to emanate directly from the body on my table. I stumbled back, my hands trembling. I looked around, searching for a rational explanation, but I was alone, as always. I decided to continue with the autopsy, forcing myself to stay composed. As I cut and examined, the whispers became more persistent. It wasn't him. It wasn't him. The voice repeated over and over. My nerves were fraying. I stepped into the small break room and drank a glass of water, trying to calm myself. This couldn't be happening. It had to be stress, exhaustion. I returned to the body, determined to finish my work quickly. But as soon as I stood over the corpse again, the voice whispered, louder this time. "Find the truth." That night, I couldn't sleep. The words echoed in my mind, creating a cacophony I couldn't silence. I returned to the body, determined to finish my work quickly. But as soon as I stood over the corpse again, the voice whispered, louder this time, "Find the truth." That night, I couldn't sleep. The words echoed in my mind, creating a cacophony I couldn't silence. I decided to investigate further. I reviewed Louis's police reports, spoke to detectives, and searched for any clue that might explain what had happened. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became. Louis had been murdered by someone close to him. Someone who knew his routines, someone with a motive. But the whispers didn't stop. Every body I examined seemed to have something to say. Some were barely murmurs, others were desperate screams. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I heard. I felt like I was losing my mind, but I couldn't ignore what I was hearing. It was as if the dead were trying to communicate their final thoughts, their darkest secrets. A particular case affected me deeply. A young woman named Eleanor was found dead in her apartment, apparently from an overdose. As I performed the autopsy, I heard a voice. I didn't mean to do it. The voice was soft, filled with sorrow. I froze, my heart pounding. Could it be that Elena hadn't taken her own life? That someone else had been involved? I decided to investigate. I spoke to her friends and family. I read through her messages and emails, and then I discovered the truth. Eleanor had been in an abusive relationship. Her boyfriend had been seen near her apartment the night she died. I took this information to the police. At first, they were skeptical, but eventually they reopened the case. Under pressure, her boyfriend confessed he had forced Elena to overdose. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the whispers continued. Every night, the bodies in the morgue seemed to beg for justice, for truth, for rest. I found myself trapped between two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead. I knew I needed to find balance, but I had no idea how. Then, one particularly dark night, while examining an unidentified body, the whispers became deafening. "Mark, Mark, help us." It was as if every voice had merged into a chorus of desperation. I felt a pressure in my chest, a suffocating sensation. I collapsed to my knees, my hands trembling uncontrollably. And in that moment, I understood. I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. I needed help, but I didn't know who to turn to. I decided to speak to a close friend, Father Anthony, a priest. I didn't tell him everything, just enough for him to understand that I was dealing with something beyond the natural. He looked at me with a mixture of compassion and concern and suggested something unexpected. Hold a mass in the morgue, a ceremony for the dead, to help them find peace. That night, Father Anthony came to the morgue. He brought holy water and a cross, and together we prayed for the souls of the dead. As we did, I felt a calmness I hadn't felt in months. The whispers began to fade. They became fainter and fainter, until finally they stopped. I knew this wasn't a permanent solution, but it was the relief I desperately needed. The following weeks were quieter. The whispers didn't disappear completely, but they became less frequent. I began to accept that my job wasn't just about dealing with the dead, but with their souls as well. I knew I had to find a way to help those who still had unfinished business in this world. But how? Over time, I became somewhat of a local legend. People came to me not only for my forensic skills, but also for my ability to hear what others could not. They knew I would do everything in my power to uncover the truth, and that somehow the whispers of the dead would always find their way to me. But I never forgot those first nights, the terror and confusion that took over my life. I never forgot the sound of the voices, the stories of pain and despair hidden within each whisper. And most of all, I never forgot that while death is the end for many, for others, it is only the beginning of a new story, one that must be heard so they can finally rest in peace. I remember that night being incredibly busy. So many bodies had passed through my hands that I wouldn't dare give an exact number. Ben, my assistant, was resting on a chair we keep in the morgue for when there's no work. I tapped him on the shoulder to wake him up and told him I was stepping out for a quick meal at the hospital cafeteria. I even asked if he wanted to come with me, but he refused, saying he was too tired. So I left him there and walked out of the autopsy room toward the hallway. As I neared the cafeteria, I ran into Josh, who was pushing a stretcher carrying yet another body. "Here's more work for you, doctor, to keep you from falling asleep," he joked. I could hardly believe it. I was already exhausted, and the workload just kept coming. I told him that when he got to the morgue, he should wake Ben up and tell him to start preparing the instruments, because I would be back soon. Without a doubt, death had already surpassed its quota for the night and wasn't done yet. I continued to the cafeteria, wondering how many more would arrive that night. Once there, I had a quick meal, poured 2 coffees into disposable cups, and headed back to the morgue to perform the autopsy on the body that awaited me. But I never made it there. Before I could reach the door, I saw my assistant running frantically toward the cafeteria. "What's wrong, Ben? Why are you running like that?" I asked. His face was pale and his voice trembled. He could barely put together a coherent sentence. The ideal thing would have been to give him a glass of water, but the cafeteria was too far, so I handed him my coffee instead. "Doctor, the dead woman spoke to me," he stammered. "I know you won't believe me, but I swear it's true." "What do you mean she spoke to you?" "The dead don't talk, Ben," I replied. It seemed ridiculous to hear this from him, after so many years of working in this field, but deep down, I knew it wasn't impossible. I just wanted him to calm down and tell me clearly what had happened. He said that while he was preparing the instruments and setting them on the table, he felt something strange, an incredibly The room was in complete disarray. Equipment was scattered across the floor, chairs were overturned, and even the comfortable armchair where Ben had been resting earlier was upside down. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating. I had worked in a morgue for years, and I was used to all sorts of unpleasant smells. But this wasn't that. This was something else, something much harder to explain. Then I saw her. Standing next to the body on the autopsy table was the spirit of the dead woman. The moment she saw me enter, she moved directly toward me. And I say toward me because the second Ben laid eyes on her, he bolted from the room, running for his life. He didn't stop until he was out of the hospital, and I knew he wouldn't be coming back. "Wait," I said, barely thinking about the fear gripping me. "I can see you and I can hear you, so I believe we can come to an agreement. If you can convince me that you are truly alive, I won't perform the autopsy and I'll wait for you to wake up. But if I convince you otherwise, then you have to let me do my job and rest in peace." Death itself seemed to consider my offer and agreed. She began telling me all the reasons why she was sure she wasn't dead, reasons that made no sense, but that she believed wholeheartedly. I listened to her without interrupting, allowing her to plead her case. Then it was my turn. I walked over to the covered body, lifted the sheet, and examined it carefully. I checked for vital signs, pointed out the pale color of her skin, and most importantly, the extreme rigidity of her body. I explained to her that yes, there have been rare cases where people were mistakenly declared dead while still alive. But in none of those cases had post-mortem rigidity set in. That, along with the bluish color of her face and nails, was undeniable proof. It took a long and difficult conversation, but eventually I convinced her of her own death. Only then did she agree to let me proceed with the autopsy. Before I began, we talked for a while longer. She told me about her life, her career. She had been a talented doctor, which was probably why she was so open to reasoning. She spoke about her family, the things she had left unfinished, and the illness that had struck her down so suddenly, giving her no time to prepare. She spoke about her grandson, who was about to be born, the one she would never get to hold. It was heartbreaking. But in the end, the autopsy was completed. I covered her body with the sheet and went to find an orderly to help move it back onto the stretcher for transport. Just before she disappeared, she looked at me one last time. "Thank you," she said. Then she smiled. "Tell Ben I'm sorry for scaring him." And with that, she was gone. Do you know what's the worst part of being a forensic doctor? If you're thinking about cutting open corpses, examining their organs, or uncovering all the secrets hidden within their anatomy, you're mistaken. Because the worst part isn't something you can even imagine. In my humble opinion, the worst of all is constantly feeling watched. Yes, because spirits make their presence known whenever I am at work or about to examine a body. They talk to me, ask me questions, and even respond. Some accept their fate with resignation, others are confused. And I've even encountered cases where the deceased refuses to believe they are dead, sometimes even attacking me, blaming me for trying to kill them. My name is Emily. I have been a forensic doctor for about 10 years now. I'm 33, and I want to take a moment to share 3 of the most chilling stories I've experienced in all these years of performing autopsies. Since I was a child, I've been able to see and even talk to spirits who, though they are supposed to leave the world of the living, refuse to move on. They continue to wander among us. Maybe you don't see them, but I, who have the gift of communicating with them, can guarantee that right now there are many around you, floating, walking, or simply standing at your side, watching what you do. Given these circumstances, you might wonder why I chose this career. Well, I chose it to help lost souls accept their new condition and guide them toward eternal rest. Though some resist, others struggle, but eventually resign themselves to their fate. The first story I will share was tragic and particularly painful. For me, death always brings sorrow. I know that. But when I see the body of a child, it hits me harder. One day, they brought in a 6-year-old boy who was found lifeless on a dangerous street in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. When I saw him, I couldn't help but shed a tear. Even after all these years, it's still hard to accept that something like this could happen to someone so young, just beginning life, with an entire future ahead of them. Just as I began the autopsy, I heard the frightened voice of a child. What happened to me? Why am I here? What are you going to do to me? My first reaction was a mix of shock and fear. Though it wasn't the first time spirits had spoken to me during my work, I wasn't expecting it. When I finally turned around, I saw him standing behind me, glowing softly, his little face filled with confusion. I didn't know how to start talking to him. A lump formed in my throat, preventing me from speaking. I placed my tools beside his body. I had to talk to him like I would to any living person. I needed to help him understand what was happening. Listen to me, little one. You are now an angel, and as such, you will go to heaven to live forever with God. I am only preparing you so that you can go without fear. I promise everything will be fine and it won't hurt. But what about my mom and dad? Are they coming? Where are they? Why can't I see them? I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know who he was, much less where his parents were. But he stood there, staring at me, waiting for me to clear up his doubts. I don't think they can go with you just yet, but one day they will. I'm sure of it. If I behave well, will you go find them and tell them to come with me? I'm scared to go alone. What if I don't know how to fly to heaven? Don't worry. The angels will come for you. They will teach you how to use the wings you are about to receive. The child hesitated. His eyes reflected sadness. He didn't want to leave without his parents, and I understood. The bond between a child and their parents is difficult to break. I had to convince him. At the same time, I had to fight back the tears that threatened to fall against my will. We talked for a long time as I continued the autopsy. He told me about his family, his 3 siblings, and even about the terrible men who had taken him from his bed, beaten him until his little body couldn't take any more pain, and how he eventually drifted into a deep sleep. Hearing that and seeing his condition, I immediately knew this innocent boy had died from a brutal beating. Now, it was up to the police to determine who had committed such an atrocity. After a long conversation, he finally agreed to let me continue my work. He seemed comforted by our talk, understanding where he was going, and that one day his parents and siblings would join him, but not yet. If they left now, his siblings would be left alone and heartbroken. At that moment, my phone rang. It was a colleague. He told me the boy's parents had arrived to identify his body and that I needed to hurry. I informed him that the body could not be released to them yet. I had discovered evidence of a violent murder. He agreed. When I hung up, I turned and met the child's pleading eyes. Please let them come in. I just want to see them. I miss them so much. What could I do? How could I deny such a request? I agreed. Although I couldn't release the body, I could allow them inside for a moment. When the parents entered, I watched as the boy's spirit lit up with joy. The parents, however, were overwhelmed with grief, unable to hold back their tears. They approached the table where his body lay. The boy stood beside them, reaching out, trying to comfort them. Don't be sad. I'll be okay. I'm an angel now, and I'll wait for you. One day we'll be together again as a family, but of course they couldn't hear him. Only I could. This gift I was born with never leaves me. After a few minutes, the parents left, leaving behind their son's body, his spirit still, lingering, waiting for the police to take him for further investigation. I turned my attention to my next case, a man who had died of natural causes. His body lay covered with a white sheet. As I prepared for the next examination, the boy's soul suddenly rushed toward me. With a bright smile, he said, "The angels have come for me." "Thank you." And then, right before my eyes, his spirit lifted, glowing with the divine light, and disappeared into the unknown, peaceful at last. This story I'm about to tell is the most terrifying experience I have ever had in all my years as a forensic doctor. It happened just 2 years ago, and even today, I shudder when I talk about it. After Ben decided to end his contract, the administration hired Mark, a burly African-American man who seemed fearless. But fear is relative because, despite his strength, he was terrified of ghosts. I always wondered why he worked as an assistant in a place like that, with its eerie atmosphere. But since I was not the one who hired him, my only option was to make sure he felt as comfortable as possible so that he wouldn't leave like the others before him. That day, when I entered the morgue, I found a body lying on the examination table, ready for processing. The stretcher bearer on duty had personal problems and hadn't come to work that night. So, I assumed Mark had brought the body himself and placed it there. The deceased was a fairly young man, probably just over 30 years old. However, he had a strange appearance, almost like a thug. He wore large, flashy earrings that, in my opinion, would have looked elegant on a woman, but seemed vulgar and distasteful on a man. Then there were the tattoos. I know that many people love getting their bodies inked, even considering it an art form. But it wasn't just the number of tattoos that disturbed me, it was the eerie, horrifying images covering nearly his entire body. Macabre figures of the underworld, sinister symbols that sent chills down my spine. I don't know much about witchcraft or occult pacts, but my first impression was that this man was a worshipper of darkness itself. Mark placed every tool in its proper position, while I put on my protective gear to begin the autopsy. But the moment I was ready to start, things took a disturbing turn. I began to hear whispers, terrifying murmurs, accompanied by a buzzing sound as if the wind were whistling through an open window. But that was impossible. The morgue was airtight and climate-controlled. Mark wasn't even in the room at that moment. He had stepped outside for a smoke. I started to feel uneasy. As I picked up the scalpel, my hand suddenly cramped, making it impossible to make the incision. I couldn't believe what was happening. I had a terrible feeling that this autopsy would be complicated, because the dead man refused to accept his death and would do everything in his power to keep me from touching his cold, lifeless body. When my hand finally regained its function, I prepared to start again. But this time, I failed once more. The corpse spoke to me. He told me I couldn't cut his body because he belonged to the darkness. If I dared to do it, I would die as well. I tried my usual method. I spoke to him, attempting to reason with him, as I always did with spirits who clung to this world. But this ghost was different. He was no longer just a lost soul. He had become something else, an entity from the underworld, with no intention of reaching an agreement. Before I could react, he lunged at me, baring his long, jagged teeth menacingly and grabbing me with clawed hands. How was this possible? Ghosts don't have physical form. To this day, I have no clear explanation, but I do know that he managed to push me, knocking me to the floor. Luckily, at that moment, Mark returned. Despite his fear of ghosts, he mustered the courage to rush at the entity and pull it off me. We both bolted from the morgue in sheer terror. "What the hell was that, Doctor?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. I told him it was the spirit of the body on the table, that it refused to let an autopsy be performed. Mark was pale. I knew this would be his last night working as my assistant, but I couldn't lie to him. This wasn't just another case of a stubborn spirit refusing to leave. We were in real danger. Even with my ability to communicate with the dead, I knew I would never be able to convince this one to move on. Then we saw him. He emerged from the morgue, floating toward us. At that moment, we had no choice but to run. We sprinted down the hallway, desperate to escape. Confronting him would have been suicidal. As we ran, we could feel his presence behind us. Not his footsteps, because he wasn't walking. He was gliding through the air, never touching the ground. In fact, I don't even think he had feet. He was just a swirling mass of dark energy, emitting horrifying screeches and shrieking that he would destroy us that night. Finally, we reached the emergency room, the most crowded area of the hospital. Bright lights, patients, doctors and nurses everywhere. We collapsed into the waiting area, struggling to catch our breath. Mark sat beside me, completely silent, more terrified than I was. After a few minutes, when I had somewhat recovered, I told him to accompany me to the on-call doctor's office so they could check his blood pressure. He looked unwell, and I was right. His blood pressure was dangerously high, so high that they had to inject him with medication because a simple pill wouldn't bring it down. The night finally ended. Neither of us returned to the morgue. But when morning came and the new shift arrived, we had to go back. Before stepping inside, we told the incoming team about the strange things that had happened with the corpse. Then we entered the morgue again. Everything was in place. Everything except the body. It was gone. Where was it? We had no idea. But we knew we were in serious trouble, possibly even legal trouble, if it didn't reappear. We searched everywhere, even in the refrigerated drawers. Nothing. I asked who had removed the body. No one, I insisted. Someone had to have taken it. But the response remained the same. No one had touched it. Confused, I asked the receptionist to check the logbook. I wanted to see if the body had even been officially registered. And the strangest thing of all, it wasn't there. To this day, it remains an unsolved mystery. My name is Andrew, and I am a forensic pathologist in Chicago. Over the years, I have learned to maintain the necessary emotional distance to deal with death every day. The bodies that arrive at the morgue tell their stories through their wounds and illnesses, and in my own way I try to bring them justice. But nothing prepared me for what I was about to discover, a truth so disturbing that it would make me question my own identity. It was a cold winter night. The wind howled outside, and the lights in the morgue flickered now and then, as if struggling against the weight of the darkness. I was alone, reviewing some reports, when the phone rang. A call from the police informed me of a new body that required an urgent autopsy. It wasn't unusual to receive calls at any hour, so I made my way to the autopsy room, preparing for another routine night. When the body arrived, I immediately noticed something strange. The body bag seemed to contain someone with a size and shape similar to mine. I thought it was just a coincidence, something my tired mind was exaggerating. I unzipped the bag And as soon as I saw the face of the deceased, my heart stopped. It was like looking in a mirror. The man on the table had my exact facial features, my same traits. Every detail of his face was identical to mine. I staggered back, stunned, trying to process what I was seeing. How was this possible? I checked the identification tag, but it contained no name, only a case number and a note stating he had been found in an alley, unidentified. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. Could this be a case of a doppelganger? A long-lost twin I never knew existed? Curiosity and fear pushed me to investigate further. I decided to begin the autopsy despite my trembling hands. Every incision, every observation made me feel as if I were dissecting my own body. The man had died from a gunshot wound to the chest, what appeared to be a cold-blooded murder. Then I found an old scar on his right arm, the same scar I had from a bicycle accident in my childhood. Every discovery chipped away at my sanity. After completing the autopsy, I couldn't sleep. The images of the body that looked exactly like me haunted my mind. I decided to dig deeper, starting with my own past. I went to see my mother, a reserved woman who had always been evasive about family history. I told her what I had found, hoping she would give me some clue to clarify the situation. To my surprise, my mother turned pale and started crying. She took my hands and, between sobs, confessed a truth she had kept hidden for decades. When I was born, I wasn't alone. I had a twin brother, but due to complications during childbirth, the doctors said he hadn't survived. However, they never showed him to her, just told her they had taken the body away for burial. The truth was, my brother had survived. But due to a bureaucratic hospital error, he had been given to another family. I was speechless. Could the man in the morgue be my long-lost twin? I decided to keep investigating, searching for any clue that could lead me to learn more about him. I went through the hospital records from the time of my birth. After hours of searching, I found documents that confirmed my mother's story. My brother had been put up for adoption, and the family that took him had vanished from any official records soon after. Days turned into a fog of unanswered questions. I spent hours poring over the murder case files, trying to find any trace of my twin's life. I discovered that he had spent his last years living on the streets, drifting from one shelter to another, leaving no trace of his true identity. It was as if he had been a ghost, existing only on the fringes of society. Finally, a lead took me to an old street friend who had known him as Ryan. This man told me that Ryan always talked about finding his lost family, about how he felt like a part of him was missing. The sadness in his eyes reflected the desperation my brother must have felt. He also told me that Ryan had gotten into trouble with a local gang, trouble that had likely led to his murder. I had to confront them. Despite the danger, I needed answers. I needed to know why they had killed my brother. I infiltrated their territory and managed to speak with one of their leaders, a man known as Bull. The conversation was tense and dangerous, but eventually he revealed the truth. Ryan had been murdered because he refused to work for them in their criminal operations. Rage and sorrow consumed me. I had found my brother, only to lose him again under the most tragic circumstances. But I couldn't let his death be in vain. I worked with the police, providing all the information I had gathered. Investigations led to several arrests, dismantling part of the gang that had caused so much suffering. In time, my brother's case was resolved in court, and those responsible received their sentences. But for me, justice couldn't fill the emptiness I felt. I had lost someone I never even had the chance to truly know, and that loss haunted me every day and night. I buried myself in work at the morgue, trying to find solace in routine. But every time I saw a body on the autopsy table, I thought of my brother, the life we never got to share. One day, while going through old case files, I found a letter written by my brother. It had been found among his belongings and turned over to the police. The letter was addressed to me, though he never got to send it. In it, he wrote about how he always knew he had a brother, how he had spent years searching for answers, and how, despite everything, he never lost hope of finding me one day. His words echoed in my soul. It was as if I could finally hear his voice, feel his presence. I made a promise to myself. I would not let his death be meaningless. I decided to dedicate my life to helping those who, like him, lived on the margins of society, to give them a voice and a chance. The morgue became my sanctuary, a place where I could honor my brother's memory and help others find peace. Every autopsy, every body was a story that deserved to be told, a life that deserved respect and dignity. And though the pain never fully disappeared, I learned to live with it, to turn it into a force for good. My brother's case taught me that life is fragile and full of mysteries. It showed me the importance of family, of love, and of justice. And though I can never get back the time we lost, I know he is at peace, and that his spirit lives on in every act of compassion and justice I carry out in his name. Thus, the morgue stopped being just my workplace. It became a place of redemption and purpose. And every time I step into the autopsy room, I feel his presence. I know that in some way he is with me, guiding me, giving me strength to face the challenges of each day.